Greetings adventurers, my name is Kramer, and this is a video that I have been wanting to make for a very long time. And let me open by saying that doing the research for this video has been insanely difficult, and I'm still not 100% sure of the hypothesis, the conversation that I'm about to start. There are so many articles that I have to verify, and pictures of costumes and architecture and weapons that are improperly labeled, and iconography that is not actually contemporary to the time and history that it's supposed to be depicting. It's been overwhelming trying to make sure that the information that I've gathered here is actually correct. And we're going to be talking about a lot of different elements from a lot of different cultures that span over 1,300 years and multiple different countries. I am bound to get something wrong. So I'm speaking very generally because this is admittedly a very broad topic, but one that I do want to broach. I sort of want to just poke the hornet's nest a little bit, but it may end up requiring a whole series of videos to break this down if you're interested. So here on the channel, we talk a lot about medieval history and about historical accuracy, etc. And the goal of all of that, at least for me, is to learn from the past in order to better understand and create a world that never existed. A fantasy world where adventurers and heroes abound and are locked in a constant struggle against evil with monsters which seek to destroy the world or the human race or whatever it is, some other fantasy, whatever floats your boat. The point is that while we attempt to learn from history with the goal of realism and believability and heightened immersion, being historically accurate where we can and where we should and learning from history, the overall name of the channel is Living Anachronism. And to me, that means more than just taking from medieval history and then adding in a healthy dose of like modern conveniences and safety precautions, and then just everything else is fantasy. And a lot of this we already understand. Oftentimes in fantasy, you can have like 10th century Viking style warriors right next to 15th century fully armored and harnessed knights mounted on giant war horses. These are both from the extreme ends of the medieval period, and they can be historically accurate in and of themselves, but obviously to have them together doesn't make any sense, historically speaking. But what I want to talk about today is how fantasy pulls things that aren't even from the medieval period, what some of those things are, and also just explore how a society like that would even come about and would have developed. So please don't think that I'm making excuses for historical inaccuracies or that I'm saying it's just fantasy, so none of it matters. That is the direct opposite of what I'm attempting to say. I'm saying that things should be historically accurate, but they don't necessarily have to be historically accurate to the medieval period, and in fantasy already, a lot of them aren't. And ultimately, a fantasy world can't really be historically accurate because it never existed. And one of the major time periods that I'm interested in exploring, which does heavily influence a lot of these sort of fantasy worlds, say like Dungeons and Dragons, is actually the 18th century. It might be more correct to instead say maybe the Stuart period. What I really mean is that like between 1600 and 1800, there's a lot of influence in fantasy. Now, it is true that in new eras, there are often carryovers of technology or fashion from the previous period, and that can happen for a myriad of reasons. It's not a video game. Old technology doesn't just simply disappear the second that a new age starts. And old things are oftentimes reused or recycled or just remade into other objects as a way of saving time and resources. But in order for those new things to make sense within the world, the time period of that fantasy universe would have to correlate to a much later human, our world, time period. Otherwise, it doesn't really make any sense. For example, let's look at the existence of rapiers in a fantasy style world. Let's say Dungeons and Dragons, because rapiers are in Dungeons and Dragons. They're considered a dex weapon. Rogues oftentimes use them. So rapiers are not a medieval weapon. They were introduced more or less in the mid 1600s. And that happened for a number of reasons. And were people still using arming swords even once rapiers had sort of been introduced into the zeitgeist? Yeah, sure, probably. But the fact that rapiers exist in this fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons world, whatever, indicates that that world exists in a time contemporary with our own 1600s, not the medieval period. Otherwise, how would these have come about? And this also implies that a number of the reasons that the rapier was invented here in our own world also carry over into this fantasy world. Otherwise, why would anyone invent this if it wasn't necessary? This creates a very interesting paradox in this fantasy world where either rapiers shouldn't exist or they should be dominant. And yet what we see in fantasy worlds instead is that the rapier coexists in harmony with weapons that are completely antiquated when compared to it. And it's sort of just up to the preference of the people within that world whether or not they want to use one or not. And all weapon types from multiple different countries and multiple different cultures exist at the exact same time with essentially equal popularity. So how could this be? My current hypothesis is that this fantasy world, we're still using Dungeons & Dragons as our sort of generic example, what we think of when we say fantasy, what comes to mind and what oftentimes art depicts is actually a prediction. It is the answer to a hypothetical question. What would have happened if the cultural advancement of the medieval period had progressed at an extremely rapid rate, but the technological advancement, especially when it comes to weapons technology, had either stayed exactly the same or stagnated completely? What would have happened if the society and the culture had continued to progress, but we just never hit the Industrial Revolution? What would have happened if everything between 500 and 1800 AD existed at the exact same time, and then all of a sudden all forward progress just simply stopped? The answer to this question, I believe, paints the exact picture of what we would expect when we are thinking of this fantasy world. How could this happen? Magic. No, seriously, magic is actually the answer. It's not like a cop-out. If magic existed and could solve the problems of the day, then technology and machinery wouldn't have been developed. It would have been unnecessary. And as a result, the architecture and the fashion and the rules of that society would have continued developing through the centuries, but the technology would have increased at a disproportionately slow rate. Because the advancement and exploration of magic and of training new magic users would have filled that role instead. And that society would eventually reach its pinnacle, where it would have been physically impossible for them to progress in the same way that we have, because you can only get so far without gas power, without electricity, without replaceable parts, without computers. Because of the Industrial Revolution, which happened on our planet Earth, because of our technology, because of our machinery, we here in the modern day are capable of progressing forward technologically at an exponentially increasing rate. Our population grows, new demands come into the market, and then new things are created with our technology in order to fill those needs. Mother necessity calls, and our answer is inventions. But in a society with magic, instead of new machines developing or new types of buildings coming about, new building techniques, instead of experimenting and advancing, this society, this fantasy society, might simply just plateau, and future generations would simply spend their time perfecting the techniques that had come before rather than creating brand new ones. A society with magic would have reached economic stability and prosperity much faster than we actually did on our own Earth. Put very simply, they would have achieved a comfortable and sustainable lifestyle before technology ever needed to even begin catching up. If that happens, technological advancement becomes obsolete, superfluous, dabbling for odd or eccentric people with no real benefit. Why go through the trouble of creating, I don't know, better firearms when a mage can just use magic missile? Why create bombs when mages can just rain fire or lightning from the sky? Why waste time trying to discover the scientific secrets of electricity to harness it for power and light when you could just cast mage light, or hire a mage that can literally just control electricity, or buy a candle that's enchanted so that it never runs out of wax? Why invest all of that time and money and resources in order to create a gadget which would just replicate what magic can already do? So having magic sort of explains why technology would take a backseat and advance more slowly, but there's also another reason I can think of, and that is if there are other sentient fantasy races like elves, dwarves, orcs, gnomes, and that sort of stuff, those would would also contribute to the technological stagnation, especially when we're talking about the weapons. And when we're talking about fantasy, they generally have medieval weapons and everything else is not medieval. A lot of our own technological advancements have come about essentially because of a never-ending arms race. Now, that's an incredibly reductive view of history, but allow me to make my point because I do think it helps explain things. Humans right now are the dominant creature on planet Earth, and we pretty much always have been because of our ingenuity and our intellect. And the only thing we've really had to compete with is each other. But in a fantasy world where human beings are not the strongest or the fastest or even the most intelligent, nor even the most numerous inhabitants of that world, there is a greater incentive for that society to not focus on conquering, but instead just survive and then adapt and then create productive relationships with the other races that exist in that world, like the elves or the dwarves. And the definite and constant threat of goblins or orcs or trolls or dragons or whatever provides a consistent enemy, if not at least a threat of an enemy. And if the weapons technology that you have is good enough to beat what you are most likely to be facing, then there's not really a need to innovate. And in the case of the more powerful races like the elves, it kind of doesn't matter how much you innovate. You are just going to lose because the elves are so much better than human beings. So instead of increasing weapons technology, what we see in a fantasy world is actually the rise of hyper-specialized people, hyper-specialized fighting units that are trained to handle these unique threats. So instead of the technology increasing, it's actually the skill of the people that's increasing, leading to certain types of warriors preferring one type of weapon over another, even if those same weapons were developed centuries apart in our own history. I can think of one very important major area where technological advancement would still be necessary, even if magic could already handle it, and that is medicine and healing. Even if magic had the power to heal people pretty much of any ailment, you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you needed healing and no one around you could do magic, or the mages were somehow cut off from their magic, or something like that. Scientific advancement in the form of alchemy, or the reproduction of magical effects through potions or healer's kits, or even the training of non-magical physicians would make perfect sense in order to maintain the living standards of the society. And also to not waste the magical resources or overburden the people that could use magic by having them deal with very simple things like a cough or an ankle sprain. And this is also exactly what we see in fantasy worlds like Dungeons & Dragons, with potions and with healer's kits for adventurers and ways of keeping people alive other than the use of magic. Now, in our own history, alchemy, potions, tinctures, and all other sorts of medicinal uses for herbs were of course used in the medieval period and were also used in the 18th century. And they were better documented in the 18th century too, I feel relatively confident in saying. The one thing that we don't really see in fantasy is the use of the humors, the four bloods, or bloodletting, things like that, specific medicinal practices from the medieval period. I think that's partly because they have magic, so even when things like the four humors are inserted into fantasy, it tends to feel antiquated anyway compared to what that society is capable of because of their magic. Science would be important, but I think it would essentially be relegated to replicating things that magic could already do, but just more easily, or at least working in tandem with magic in order to create some sort of desired effect. I'm thinking of when Kira Metz created the cure for the Catriona plague in The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. That's a perfect example. And ultimately, from the perspective of a world builder or someone who's interested in fantasy-style reenactment, pulling from the 18th century makes a lot of sense. It makes our job a lot easier, because going strictly off of medieval sources, one, that's like 1,000 years, so there's a lot of leeway with what's actually historically accurate, but it will still, especially if you're focusing in on one certain subset of the medieval period, leave you with a lot of gaps that you have to fill in. And I personally think that it's better to fill them with elements from another time period that still work and are practical than it is to just fill them in with something that doesn't actually make sense. So let's look at some more elements in fantasy that are actually pulled from later time periods in our own human history. Let's talk about food first. Things like tomatoes, which I love. I love tomatoes. Anything that is made with tomatoes, I will eat it. I would never want to say goodbye to tomatoes. Yet tomatoes were viewed as being poisonous up until like the mid-18th century. Potatoes, which are another delicious food that I would never want to say goodbye to, were not introduced to Europe until the 16th century. An increased number of different types of alcoholic spirits, which are supposed to be drunk like recreationally in taverns. This is not getting into the idea of taverns being more of an 18th and 17th century thing than a medieval thing to begin with. Shad has a video on that. But until the mid-15th century, distilled spirits were called by a number of people aqua vitae, which means water of life essentially, and they were used sparingly and medicinally. And up until then, it was mostly beer and wine that would have been, you know, commercially available to the populace, oftentimes being brewed in monasteries. And when people discovered distillation, or by discovered I mean like kind of rediscovered and then just started experimenting more with, when people started experimenting with distillation, the thing that they distilled first was oftentimes wine, resulting in brandy. And it wasn't until the early to mid 16th century that things like whiskey were really starting to be developed. And even the Gaelic word for whiskey still means water of life. So as it was being developed, it was kind of only the elites, at least as far as I could find, that were really importing things like whiskey to like just drink recreationally. And it wasn't until the 17th century when people, like colloquially, I don't know if that's the right use of that term, where people actually started just drinking whiskey cause. Even tobacco, which is not really a food, or pipeweed as you might know it if you are a hobbit, which is almost an iconic staple for fantasy at this point, being used of course in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. It's kind of ubiquitous, the idea of like the ranger smoking his pipe in a tavern or an inn. Tobacco was not introduced to Europe at least until the end of the 1500s, which I guess you could argue is the latter couple decades of the medieval period, but it's kind of the Renaissance. And it definitely wasn't commercially produced until the 1600s, once America really started being cultivated. So speaking of America, let's talk about the society as we often see it represented in fantasy style worlds. The medieval societal structure, hierarchical feudal system, with lords and vassals and the majority of people being serfs, is not really seen in things like Dungeons and Dragons or generic sort of fantasy. People oftentimes retain their titles. Generally speaking, in fantasy at least, we see a society with a much bigger focus on individual freedoms and personal pursuits taking sort of precedence, very similar to the ideals that were pioneered during our own 18th century Enlightenment period. Fantasy societies tend to emphasize personal agency, individual rights, and operate almost on a kind of meritocracy-based system. That's kind of how adventuring functions. And just as in the Enlightenment era, where we witnessed a surge in scientific inquiry and philosophy, fantasy worlds oftentimes showcase characters who possess either an understanding or a yearning to understand, you guessed it, magic and the arcane arts. In fantasy, there tends to be better class mobility, and that actually is one of the driving factors for a lot of people choosing to go on adventures. And once we start talking about guilds, I mean, from a certain point of view, adventuring is kind of like just state-sponsored privateering a little bit. In Dungeons and Dragons specifically, like there are plenty of fantasy universes where adventuring is nothing like that. Fashion. This is a huge topic, probably deserving of its own video with maybe some like interviews with experts or something. The fashion and clothing styles that we tend to see depicted in generic D&D style fantasy realms often exhibit influences from the 18th century. And while medieval elements are present, we can observe the incorporation of things like waistcoats or westkits and frock coats, etc. Look at the Shire from The Lord of the Rings, both as described in the book and also as represented in Peter Jackson's films. That's 18th century. Even Aragorn's ranger outfit shares a lot more in common with the idea of a waistcoat and a frock coat, and he just happens to be wielding a longsword, than it does with what we would expect from a medieval period, with a series of tunics that are ultimately the same length and then just belted, or a doublet or something like that. And a lot of the other human races in Peter Jackson's films do take, especially from the early medieval period, I'm thinking of Rohan specifically, they look very Anglo-Saxon, but that doesn't change the fact that when combined with the hobbits that exist in the same world, we have elements that are separated by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years within our own history, and it all just sort of fits very seamlessly together to be believable. The tailored sort of silhouettes, and I'm thinking of fantasy rogues, they tend to have very sort of close form-fitting garments, is something that we really only begin to see at the Renaissance, and then it continues to develop through the 18th century as clothing becomes slimmer to the body, and this more sort of form-fitting, individualistic style would only be possible once that society had reached a certain amount of economic stability to allow people to begin experimenting with things. And as I've illustrated, this would have come about definitely, and also much faster, in a fantasy society with magic. In fantasy, we also rarely see the very large sleeves and pant legs that are associated with both the Renaissance and the Tudor periods. Farmers are often depicted wearing suspenders and white shirts with waistcoats, not tunics with brays and hose. And even the idea of like the taller boot is more in keeping with the 18th century. It at least would have been more common than it would have been in the medieval period, according to the research that I've done. One of the biggest, most ubiquitous things, the idea of the bodice, right, which is very popular, very common for females in Renaissance costuming, medieval costuming, LARP costuming, fantasy costuming, and it is represented an awful lot in fantasy depictions, like with art. This sort of like white puffy sleeve shirt or blouse with the bodice, which is laced in the front, and then a separate skirt on the bottom, sometimes with a separate apron, which also just goes over the bottom as well. That is definitely not a medieval look. It is at least 16th century, if not 17th century. Dresses tended to be one single piece. That was like the silhouette that they preferred in the medieval period, again, according to what I have seen. But I don't claim to be an expert in especially female fashion, but I'm still saying it anyway. In general, for fantasy style worlds, we see way less medieval inspired headwear, like wimples or the bicocket hat or the Tudor cap or the chaperone. They tend not to be included in these depictions, probably because they look a little bit silly. And I remember that The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt was especially interesting to me because it actually depicts clothing from the 14th and 15th centuries fairly historically accurately in a fantasy world. And I think this is maybe one of the reasons why I tend to prefer either Dark Ages or 17th, 18th century styles personally when it comes to fantasy, or this sort of anachronistic amalgamation of those things, because cod pieces and the really, really long pointed shoes, they just look a little strange to me, and definitely aren't conducive to like adventuring and fighting goblins. I appreciate the historical significance of them, and it's very fascinating to learn about them and how they were made, but it is funny. And I did personally dress in Elizabethan style clothing when I played Captain Francis Drake at the Connecticut Renaissance Fair. It was fun, but I definitely thought I looked better as Robin Hood, which would have been 1200s, 1300s. And even when I was Robin Hood, I tried wearing my hood underneath the bicocket hat that they gave me, because that is something that was historically done, and I was told that even though it's historical, don't do it because it looks ridiculous. And I'm gonna be honest, I agree. Briefly, I do just want to bring up architecture as it's portrayed in a lot of fantasy realms, and I make no mistake, I'm the first person to admit that architecture is not my area of expertise, but that's where I leave it to you in the Discord and in the comments below. Gothic cathedrals, or Gothic castles and Renaissance-style villas sort of coexisting side by side with other styles of medieval architecture like wattle and daub or other sorts of housing or huts, together, very much like the rapier, suggests that the contemporary time of that fantasy world has extended past the medieval period. Otherwise, those later styles of architecture wouldn't really exist. Now, Gothic architecture itself is contemporary to the medieval period. It is itself medieval, but it was mostly used when constructing churches. Yet in fantasy, we often see Gothic-style castles with these very tall, pointy, towered roofs and the flying buttresses on the castles, and this is, to my understanding, less of a medievalism and more of the neo-Gothic revival consistent with Victorian time periods. The intricate architectural designs and the grandeur of these buildings, which were used for personal houses, or guild halls, or whatever you'd like to say, reflect advancements that were made during the Renaissance and then later in the Baroque period and carried through into the 18th century. And this is also evident in the way that actual castles themselves look as they're presented in fantasy worlds. With bare stone walls, they're often dimly lit and cold. This is how castle ruins look. look to us today. Yet it is often how they are also showed in fantasy. Castles often do not look in fantasy how they would have looked in the actual medieval period, where they're fully whitewashed and they're painted with these ornate designs on the walls, or covered up with intricate, sometimes even garish tapestries. And even when castles in fantasy are decorated more innately, they tend to mirror, again, the Victorian reconstructions of those castles with the all wood paneled interiors and the finials and the coats of arms displayed on the walls. That's not medieval. It's much, much later. And a lot of us already know that these are Victorian isms and that they are not actually representative of how these castles would have looked within their own contemporary time period, the medieval period. But what I'm proposing is that given how frequently these later periods seem to influence this fantasy world, that perhaps it's not a mistake or an inaccuracy that needs to be corrected, but rather that fantasy worlds might very logically look like this, like these later periods, and have a lot in common with them. Now, none of this is to say that there aren't fantasy worlds that do take heavily, if not mostly, from the medieval period or specific time periods within the medieval period, like just the 1000s or something like that, or that you couldn't design a fantasy world like that if you wanted to. I personally find myself partial to both like Dark Ages style, like myth and saga, and then also the sort of broad anachronistic amalgamation style of fantasy. And part of a series of videos that I'd like to do, essentially starting now, is exploring just how much we can take from, say, the 18th century and learn from it and use it in fantasy, and how much is like too much. Because honestly, the way the 18th century society is structured is almost more conducive to the idea of adventuring than the actual medieval period. Roads are better established. The economy is generally more prosperous enough to allow better class mobility and for commoners to hold jobs that are not just farming. And one of the biggest things I can think of is just like the style of equipment and the distinct lack of having to carry around armor. Carrying around plate, carrying around chainmail, you just simply wouldn't do that unless you had to because you were on military campaign. But in a medieval setting where you were expecting to be fighting all sorts of different creatures or brigands or stuff like that, you would also need to wear armor, or at least bring it if you were directly looking for trouble or anticipating it, or you'd be going into a fight where you were under-equipped and that would make you kind of stupid. Yet even in The Lord of the Rings, with those famous adventuring parties, with Bilbo and Frodo respectively, the members of those parties are not dressed for war. They're not dressed for combat, they're dressed for traveling, and that makes a lot of sense. And when they are faced with the situation where war is inevitable, like a skirmish, they just have what they have, or they find new equipment, they put it on for the Battle of Five Armies or the Battle of the Hornburg, and then they take that equipment off and then proceed. So I think that in a real fantasy setting, we would probably see armor utilized a lot less than we give it credit for, which for a game like Dungeons & Dragons creates a very strange problem where you need the armor in order to travel and do your job, but you don't want to travel if you have to wear the armor. So the solution for fantasy is simply to have a world where there is less armor for everybody, where the armor is available and still viable and used, but just less people that are not part of the main military are using it. The solution that history and potentially fantasy provides to us as well is the advent of firearms, very basic sort of flintlock or wheellock style firearms. With their invention, armor became obsolete because the damaging power of these early arquebuses was just so far ahead of what armor could protect it from. People just stopped using it. And I think a very similar effect would come about because of magic or because of fighting things like dragons, where pretty much no matter what you're wearing, it's not going to protect you. And this results in a situation where, yes, like knights, armored combatants that are planning on facing other knights or other orcs or something like that would still wear armor, but the average person and the average people that the adventurers would be fighting would not be wearing armor, which is good because it means that the adventurer doesn't have to lug it around, and they're still not at a disadvantage when they're fighting other people because they're not lugging it around either, completely making adventuring more viable. And we see this in plenty in the 17th and 18th centuries from multiple countries, where you don't need an entire war caravan just to go to a new place, but instead you have lots more exploration. You have lots more people creating very detailed maps and going on expeditions that way. You have people that are going on very, very long hunting trips, like the long hunters here in the 18th century and the 17th century here in America. That does present the question, how would having less armor in the world affect the equipment that an adventurer would choose to carry on an adventure? That's definitely a topic for another video, but in the meantime, I would like to wish you good luck on your adventures. See you soon. A huge thank you goes out to my Patreon supporters. The amount of time that I had to spend finding and reading and then researching the validity of various articles and looking for the pictures and then editing this full video together is an amount of time that would not have been expendable to me if not for your support.